We thought tonight it would be appropriate if we began the evening with the singing of O Canada. We have on the piano Joan Bull, who is a graduate nurse and an accomplished pianist, and Michael Chow, who is the chaplain at St. Mary's Hospital. So would you please rise? Thank you, Joan. Michael? I'd now like to introduce Dr. Michael Higgins, the president of St. Jerome's University, so he can bring you formal greetings. Michael?
Thank you, Douglas. It's my pleasure indeed to welcome all of you here this evening to our Catholics in Public Life Conference. And I just want to say a couple of words by way of what this is about. Many years ago, Liverpool Hope University in England established a conference called Catholics in Public Life. It was an effort on behalf of the Catholic community in England to draw together people from cultural, from political life, from leadership and health and education to come together to talk about how they could make a difference in England. We have modeled the Catholics in Public Life Conference somewhat on that notion, but with many Canadian modifications. One, we're working very closely with the Catholic District School Board, Waterloo Catholic District School Board. They are our partners, equal partners in this undertaking. Two, we don't define the Catholics in Public Life Conference as something to provide an event or an environment where members of the tribe talk to each other. We want this to be seen as inclusive, not exclusive. But we understand the supreme importance of Catholics and Catholic leaders to come together to talk about issues that matter, and that matter for everyone, for all the citizenry. For this reason, Catholics in Public Life, now in its third year, provides a wonderful opportunity and an environment for mutual exploration and understanding. But it is by no means designed or structured in such a way to exclude people who are not Catholic. We most certainly welcome them to the conversation, simply because it deepens our own mutual understanding. So that's what Catholics in Public Life is about. I'm going to ask Louise Irvin, the chair of the Waterloo District Catholic School Board, to introduce the Lieutenant General himself in just a few seconds. But let me just simply say this. I returned from a conference at the University of Notre Dame, where I had been for several days with our chaplains, and on one occasion, sitting at the table beside an archbishop from Santa Fe and a couple of very interesting young Holy Cross fathers who teach in the Department of Political Science at the University of Notre Dame, they were talking about this particular experience they had on the campus just shortly before we arrived. They had representatives from Rwanda there, and they were talking about the crisis, the perduring crisis in Rwanda, and most especially what they were talking about the dreadful massacres of so many years past. I mentioned that we were here at St. Jerome's University hosting Lieutenant General Romeo Dallaire. And I assumed, as one often does in this kind of a context, that I have to explain who he is, because he's a Canadian, and this is an exclusively, almost exclusively American context, and I have to say, what he did, who he was. It was unnecessary to do any such explanation. At the table, they all knew who he was. Even more impressively, completely, comprehensively, they admired him. They knew a great deal about what he had done, and they knew as much about what their country and other countries had not done. So I think we're in for a treat, if you like, a wonderful opportunity as part of the Catholics in Family Life, Catholics in Public Life Conference, which goes for the weekend, to see, well, Catholicism and faith in action. Louise.
Leadership is being human. This is our guest speaker's motto. This is how Lieutenant General Romeo Dallaire encouraged his soldiers to continue working in the midst of the world's most horrific situation ever seen by our Canadian Armed Forces when they were asked to join the UN peacekeeping force in Rwanda. Le génocide au Rwanda en 1994 a apporté un nouveau niveau d'horreur à la communauté internationale. The United Nations had never faced a humanitarian tragedy of such magnitude. Through various media, pictures of Rwandan victims came into our homes. With those, the face, the name, and the person of Lieutenant General Romeo Dallaire quickly became a household name in Canada. General Dallaire informed his command at the UN, alerting decision makers to the gravity of the situation. The resources to halt the genocide, however, were never provided. Despite the lack of support and the limitations of his force, he exerted untiring personal and professional efforts to protect and save those he could. He was asked to leave Rwanda 3 times, and although he could have chosen to leave, he chose to stay along with a volunteer force in order to preserve human life. Lieutenant General Dallaire was able to lead his soldiers because he showed humanity towards them. He cried with them, shared their pain, and most of all, he treated them as humans, not machines. Upon his return from serving as force commander of the UN mission to Rwanda, for which he was awarded the Meritorious Service Cross, he served as commander of the 1st Canadian Division and deputy commander of the Canadian Army. He was subsequently promoted to 3-star general and served as Assistant Deputy Minister, Human Resources, Military. He continues to assist the Canadian Forces in Veterans Affairs Canada in matters related to post-traumatic stress disorder. With the recent International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, we once again witnessed his inner strength, his courage, and his compassion for all victims of war. We witnessed the truly great Canadian person he is. Lieutenant General Dallaire is a visiting lecturer to a number of Canadian and American universities. He has written numerous articles on conflict resolution, humanitarian aid, human rights, and on leadership. He is now a special advisor to the Canadian International Development Agency and to the Minister of International Cooperation on war-affected children, an advisor to the Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade on the prohibition of small arms distribution. He has received a fellowship at the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University to pursue his research in conflict resolution. He has been invested in the Order of Canada, one of Canada's highest awards, and awarded the United States Legion of Merit. He is the first recipient of the Aegis Award on Genocide Prevention from the United Kingdom. He has received numerous honorary doctorates from several Canadian universities. He is married and the father of 3 children. His book, Shake Hands with the Devil, was a bestseller in Canada in 2003 and has just won the Writers' Trust Award for Political Writing in Canada. In addition, the producer of the Oscar-winning movie Bowling for Columbine plans to make a movie of Dallaire's life. Ladies and gentlemen, c'est avec un très grand plaisir que je vous présente notre invité d'honneur ce soir. Please welcome Lieutenant General Romeo Dallaire.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for coming out this evening and listening, hopefully, to something that will not only be of interest, but will challenge you and maybe even disturb you a bit, which I hope will be perceived as with the optimism and with the dynamic that it should, as we look at ourselves, but also look at our country and look at humanity, not just now, but into the future. Now, I have to use, not being an academic, every pedagogical tool I can find, so I'll try to make this thing work here. And, it's close, eh? Let me just make that work. There we go. Okay, now I'm dangerous. I will speak in North American English. That's a mixture of our use of Oxford and the American use of Webster in pronunciation. And I can do that because it's my second language. My first language is Québécois, which some of my unkindly friends from France would say 18th century French. I learned English as a young boy in a cub pack. My mother was a Dutch war bride. My father had joined the army in 1928 and served 6 years overseas, and they met, and I'm of the first year of the baby boomers. And she had learned in high school English, French, German, and Dutch. And so she certainly felt that a second language was essential. And she had been in the guide movement, so Cubs seemed to be a good instrument, because in East End, Montreal, there was an English Protestant school not far from where we lived, and I was a unilingual French-Canadian Catholic boy, and so in the 50s, I would go on Tuesday nights to Cubs and on Wednesday mornings to confession. I always had this fear of being found out at the annual church parade at the Anglican Cathedral, but anyways, that sort of worked. My sixer was an ambitious young man. He wanted to win the Akela pennant, and so one of the things he and my colleagues did was teach me a rhyme. It's a boy's rhyme of that time. I don't think it offends. It goes something like this. When you're out with your honey and your nose is a runny, don't think it's funny, because it's not. Now, I must say I'm quite impressed that you picked it up pretty fast. It took me 1.5 years to figure the damn thing out. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to, if I may, bring you into recent history. And I'll talk about the end of the Cold War as a reference point, because it is a major reference point, certainly in the developed world, as we move from that era of the Cold War. bring you through to today and project into the future. And I will, in so doing, be using Rwanda and also the experiences of that in regards to the thematic of this evening, which is, in fact, Catholics and public life. I must tell you that my ambitions to be a leader started very young. After my experience with the Cubs, I became a choir boy and then a servant of Mass and made my way through the ranks of Ferrer and Cérémoniaire. And on occasion, we had a vicar who enjoyed a bit too much of the Mass wine, and so sometimes nearly took over from him. But anyways, we made our way through. But on Thursday mornings at 7 o'clock, there weren't too many people watching. So, ladies and gentlemen, the era in which we are in is a complex one. It's not a sad one. It could lead you to pessimism, certainly with the 9/11 scenario. But it is, in my opinion, a transition phase of enormous complexity that has so much more merit than, in fact, the era of the Cold War. Because we are now facing some of the enormous clashes that had been subsumed by the authorities of the East and the West during the Cold War, and as such simply were held in abeyance until the opportunity presented itself to come to the fore. And so that's why in this era we are seeing so many conflicts in the world, conflicts that are deep-seated in nature, from religious conflicts to ethnic conflicts, to some that are pure power sharing, and others are absolutely fundamentally humanitarian crises and conflicts thereof. This is quite different from, in fact, the Cold War era. And as such, I must tell you that our assessment of the last 15 years has been is that we were taken by surprise and we've been muddling through. This is, in fact, a general's dream. Small map, big arrows. We're going to do a left or right flanking, and we attack at dawn. And when Norman Schwarzkopf gave the order that morning, 600,000 troops moved. And they moved with the equipment of the modern era and the doctrines and the training of the modern era. In fact, everything that we had learned during the Cold War in NATO was applied there with that coalition. And we won. The fact that the enemy was fighting still with World War I technology and philosophy was irrelevant. We won. And that exercise, although politically it was not won, but on the battlefield it was, is and has been the exception of this era. Classic warfare, where governments have their armies in different equipments and uniforms and doctrines, and there are lines in the sand somewhere, and all of a sudden the political structures, for one reason or another, can't solve the problem, and they send young people out to fight under the orders of generals, and sooner or later one of them wins, and decisions are taken thereafter. That classic warfare that we've had since the Treaty of Westphalia with the government, the people, and the military, that we saw in the Second World War, and a bit more complex as we saw the Vietnam War, but essentially was the essence of all the training that we were doing, expecting World War III and the Cold War. That's the exception. It's not the norm. In fact, the Gulf War campaign, the air campaign in Kosovo, and the recent run to Baghdad by the American-led coalition have been the only times where all of classic warfare has been used, but very, very limited in a battlefield. We discovered that that type of warfare was not, in fact, anymore the norm at the end of the Cold War, and not just because of the peace dividend. It's because there was a changing nature of warfare. But also we have a changing nature of peacekeeping. This is the Rwandan mission, which was to be a classic Chapter 6 Personnian peacekeeping mission. Both sides had decided to stop fighting. North of that yellow DMZ, there's about 12,000 rebels, and south of it, there's about 20,000 government troops. And in the capital, they finalized a peace agreement, and they needed a referee, just like in Cyprus, to monitor that everybody's playing by the rules. And ultimately, someday, that peace agreement will lead them to a nation, as we would hope one day Cyprus will be. And that's essentially the mission that I was given, and it failed. That classic peacekeeping in this era exists no more. And so even the term peacekeeping is questioned. And so with no more of the classic peacekeeping for which we've been known so much in the past, which in fact the Canadian people have put us, given us this mantra of peacekeepers, we found ourselves in the late 80s and the early 90s into a whole different exercise than what was expected of peacekeeping. And that, in fact, although peacekeeping during the Cold War used up about 5% of our time, it gave us 95% of our publicity. 95% of our time was preparing to fight World War III in Europe. In Europe. And this whole era post-Cold War has gotten us not only out of the classic warfare and the classic peacekeeping, but has also gotten us significantly outside of Europe and into far parts of the world. And so, in trying to define what has been happening, I turned to a great American philosopher who wrote this decades ago, but I think it's more pertinent now than it's been at any time. There is nothing anymore that's sort of standard. It's and we've been using the term change, but often there are other terms that can be used. And in this evolution and this change that we found, is that for, as an example, the military side, as the diplomats and humanitarians are working in these missions, we discovered a whole other entity. An entity that is not classic in any way, shape, or form, dressed or so on, but an entity also that doesn't necessarily play by the rules, that is in fact beyond rules. And we discovered barbarism and horrors that only those who have lived and have seen physically in those last days of the concentration camps, or who have gone to Cambodia or Vietnam in certain areas, have seen the horrors on the scale and in the type that we've seen over the last 10, nearly 12 years. And this in far-off lands that not only target their own people, but in fact even target those who are there at their demand to help them. And discover that peacekeeping, as we knew it, doesn't fit the bill of what is exactly going on and has been going on. And to the extent, the great dichotomy of you're here to help people, but they're shooting at you and killing your people, just doesn't make logic in the field. And certainly the Americans now in Baghdad and around Iraq are in fact facing that incredible problem of, I thought we were here to help them, Why are they killing us? And so in this era of post-Cold War, an era that was baptized, if I can use the term, by George Bush Sr. as a new world order, we found ourselves in a new world disorder, and a complex one. We found ourselves in an era where, although we are working from fundamental laws that have evolved, in fact, over centuries in some of them, that we are being held accountable to these laws by our nations, by our judicial systems that the expression thereof, by our own military laws, which are subordinate to the national laws, of course. And international law is that we're facing dilemmas that don't seem to have an obvious answer in the field. And we don't seem to be getting the answers from our leaders. And very often find ourselves in quandaries that attack some of the fundamental values for which we have, in fact, grown up with and have guided us over the years. We didn't find ourselves in areas that are simply replete with barbaric, ignorant people. We found ourselves in places where the leadership, the elite, are very well educated, very knowledgeable. They graduate from our own schools. The politicos in Rwanda graduated from the French Canadian universities, Montreal and Quebec City, from Université Louvain in Paris. The English side, there are some that graduated from University of Toronto in the States. On the military side, the same thing. The government were trained in Brussels and in Paris, and the rebels were trained and educated in the higher schools of the United States and the UK. These people passed their exams and in fact are very knowledgeable in how to move their country, move their populations, and move even public opinion and the great powers when they can and when they must. And so we underestimated what was going on in those countries and who were the players and how they functioned. This is an example of the era. President Habyarimana was part of the rebellion in 1962 that threw out the Belgians, the colonial power. It also threw out a minority ethnicity of the country called the Tutsis. And in so doing, established themselves as a government that could have been democratic, but ended up by being autocratic and in fact a dictatorship. And many of the countries that went through the trauma and crisis of the getting rid of colonial powers and becoming independent, many of them became lackeys to the East and the West during the Cold War and were subjugated by dictatorships and autocrats that we, in fact, put into power or supported. In Rwanda, the soccer stadium was built by the Americans, but the roads were built by the Russians and Chinese. And so many of these countries, we funded these dictators to maintain control on them because none of us wanted to go to World War III over Tanzania or Rwanda or the Congo. And so the best way to ensure that no flare-ups would happen was to buy them off and keep control. And so in very few countries did any of the process of democratization or human rights ever see the light of day. And then all of a sudden in 1989, we turned towards them and we said, listen, we don't need you anymore. Cold War's over. So why don't you sort yourself out? And in most cases, that's what they've been doing with a variety of results. You have the humanitarian crisis that degenerates into a security problem like Somalia. Hundreds of thousands of people dying of lack of food, water, and medical supplies. And as we're in there trying to assist, the warlords take over and in fact turn the thing into a crisis that paralyzes the whole support. Or you have a Rwanda where in fact you have people in power who don't want to share power, create the friction that ends up in the civil war, and subsequently also create a humanitarian catastrophe which ended up as a genocide. And in these imploding nations around the world, and not just in Africa, human rights and democracy were put to the side or were being fought for by moderates who are being slaughtered and destroyed. And they've asked the international community through the UN for assistance, support, in order to stabilize it. And so that's how we end up over the last 15 years in parts of the world we never expected to be. Our diplomats, our military, police, and humanitarians, looking and involved in problems of great complexity and not simplicity. Great complexity because of the interconnections of race, religion, cultures that have been festering for decades, even centuries, if you include the colonial era. And so in those regions where they've been screaming for support and help, we have been committing capabilities, and we've been committing people, and we've been taking casualties in so doing. And the question is there a plan in this? Is there something, in fact, behind all this? Do we simply continue to ad hoc our way through these demands for support and wait for the next one, the Chad or the Sudan, or a South American country, or go back to Sri Lanka? Do we just wait for these nations to continue to implode, and we will send or not send so many troops and so much money and diplomatic effort depending on what's the available assets of the day? Or is there something behind that? Is there a plan? Is there an aim? Is there something behind us trying to work with that 80% of humanity that's living out of the 5 and 6% of quality of life, that are getting more and more enraged at that 20% that pretentiously are stating that humanity is advancing? The proof is we're going to Mars. The proof is in our intellectual depth. Humanity is advancing. Ladies and gentlemen, a part of humanity is advancing. The 20% is advancing. That 80% is regressing. And it's regressing because it's still considered as a residual problem. Not a mainstream effort by those in humanity who can influence, but a residual. After we've got all our own priorities sorted out, how much can we throw at that? And are there enough NGOs and do-gooders to handle the problem? As long as that 80% is a residual and doesn't have the fundamentals of dignity and hope and aspirations into a better future, and are treated with an inhumane set of parameters, until that 80% is able to move above that, we are not allowed to say that humanity is advancing. It is simply wrong, unethical to say so. Now that statement doesn't necessarily gain support from many quarters. In Rwanda, one of the tricks that the extremists use to reinforce or to aid and abet and sustain their operations was to use children, young children, 5, 6, 10, to stop convoys of food and water and medical supplies, or even convoys of moving people between the lines for their own protection. And the children had to stay in the road to block the convoys, because if they didn't, they'd be shot or killed by machete. And so when the convoys would stop, they'd be attacked and people would be killed and stuff stolen. And one day I was coming between the lines after some negotiations, and I saw a couple hundred meters ahead of me a young child in the middle of the road. And so I immediately expected an ambush, because you just don't leave a child in no man's land in the road. And so I had a couple soldiers with me, and we slowed down. We stopped, jumped out, expecting an ambush. There was no ambush. And then we started to go through the huts along the road, and people had been killed, and they've been decaying there for weeks on end, and half eaten by dogs and rats and so on. And as we're looking for somebody and yelling for some adults, we lost a child. So we had to go back and find the child. Found him in a hut where there were 2 adults, male, female, and a couple children, and all decomposing. And he was sitting in a corner, comfortably, as if it was his home. We couldn't understand that the wild dogs had not eaten him. And there he was, living amongst that. So I picked him up, and I brought him to the middle of the road, and he had his stomach that was bloated, and he had scars, and there were insects all over him, and he was dirty, and he had rags on. And after looking at all that, I finally looked into his eyes. And lo and behold, in looking into his eyes, I discovered that those eyes were exactly the same eyes as my 3-year-old boy. They were no different. They were the eyes of a human child. The eyes of a human child. No different. Now there are differences from race and religion and ethnicities and cultures and sovereignty and nationalism and everything else. The way you dress. And some of those differences have been abused and pushed to the extent of demeaning other people, and to the real extreme of going towards racism. But fundamentally, we're all the same. Those 2 children, my son and that child, were exactly the same. Circumstances and dimensions made them different, superficially. But in the essence of them, they were both human. And they had heart, and they had souls. They were the same. About 5 days into the genocide, a large world power had sent troops to come in, and really a few officers to look and do an assessment. And by then there were already a lot of people who were killed, and we were trying to move some of the bodies out of there because of the stench and so on. And we were already burning them with diesel. And the stench was it wasn't an odor, it was like an oil that entered all your pores. It stayed, always stayed, never left us during the near 4 months of that war. And so these officers came to debrief me, and they said, "General, we're going back home. We're recommending our country not send any troops to stop this slaughter." And I said, "Why not?" Well, he said, "Sir," he said, "you see, Rwanda really doesn't count. You know, it's got absolutely no strategic geographic value to us. It's not even worth putting a radar station here. It's got no strategic resources. It's only tea and coffee, and the bottom has fallen out of those markets. In fact, what it's got is humans, and too many of them. And so that's not within our national interest, and so we're not coming." One other country even did the computations and felt that for every one of the soldiers they'd send there who would be killed or injured, an equivalent of about 85,000 dead Rwandans would be acceptable by their people and their government as the cost of assisting to stop a genocide. And so the question that came out of that was, are all humans human, or are some more human than others? Is it possible that some humans count more than others? Or those white, soldiers from developed countries more important than the tens of thousands of Rwandans who are dying and being slaughtered? Is there a difference? Well, in Rwanda, we had a genocide. It took a fair length of time to call it that. In fact, it took nearly 3 weeks before I even used the term. Because genocide, to me, from my upbringing, was essentially the Holocaust. I had never been able to see something different. It was never explained differently to me. And I couldn't imagine a Holocaust. It's only with the Red Cross and I that we discussed it, realized that in fact it was a genocide, and we started to push it. And as this thing was a genocide, and people started to finally agree to that, Boutros Ghali, as the Secretary General, took to the 29th of April, 3 weeks plus to accept it. And the Americans and the other powers took nearly into the middle of May to accept it. That would have called, if we're playing by the rules, for them to react and stop the genocide. Even with the use of the term genocide, nobody came. They all pulled out in the first week of the genocide and the civil war, and they didn't come back. Yet at that same time, we were pouring tens of thousands of troops and billions of dollars of aid into ex-Yugoslavia. There were more people killed, injured, internally displaced, and refugeed in Rwanda than there were in the 6 years of the war of ex-Yugoslavia. But in Rwanda, black Africans killing each other is tribalism. They've always done it. It's natural. So we'll let them at it, and then it'll stop some more, and then we'll throw some cash at it, and hopefully somebody will go and help them out. And we'll Pontius Pilate our way out of this. But Yugoslavia is different. These are great religions who have been studied, and the frictions of those religions. These are great languages, and the frictions of their cultures that come from them. There's a great Ottoman Empire that disintegrated. And so in Yugoslavia, although they were pulling fetuses out of women and chopping them up, and they were chopping heads and raping women and girls and so on, just like they were doing in Rwanda, in Yugoslavia it's ethnic cleansing. It's very sophisticated, it's tough. And of course, it's in Europe, and so we got to do something about it. And so we do react there. Black Africans in the middle of Africa killing themselves is tribalism. It's banal. Are all humans human? Are some humans more human than others? And so, ladies and gentlemen, many of the debates of our witnessing Rwanda and many of the soldiers who have witnessed in other countries and diplomats have taken our faith, taken our perspectives of life, what is right and what is wrong, and have shaken them to their foundations. There is no military training to witness crimes against humanity and stand by and watch because of political rules of engagement. And at the end of that, feel that you've done your job. A corporal was leading a small patrol into a village, and he was stopped at the barrier of the village. And there was a great kerfuffle inside the village, and he could look beyond the barrier, and he saw a couple hundred people, men and women, who were edging on this girl, about 14 years old, had a machete in her hand and a child on her back. And they were edging her on to kill this other girl about the same age with a child on her back. And this corporal's looking at this. So the question is what does the corporal do? Does the corporal open fire on the people at the barrier and then open fire on the crowd and kill God knows how many women and possibly children to save that girl? Does the corporal tell his best shot to shoot the girl with the machete and probably kill her child? Or does the corporal walk on and say, hey, I can't use force, and even in front of crimes against humanity, we must carry on and walk away. And with what does that corporal take that decision, and what gives him the strength to carry on and put that behind? Well, we discovered that in the face of this incredible array of destruction, that some of our more fundamental references may be stronger than we really thought they were. That what we were learning and living in our society, in this society, this Canadian society, gave us enormous power. Our religious beliefs, our social justice, our sense of humanity, of human rights, gave us great power, but in the same time brought us trauma in regards to what to do. There's a sergeant who was leading a patrol that entered the village, and they arrived too late. And with his 15 soldiers, they went through the village, and everybody was killed, except all of a sudden the chapel doors opened, and a whole bunch of men, women, and children came out. Now this was very unusual. For all the churches and the monasteries, every religious place was used as a slaughterhouse. They don't play by the rules. And so what they did is the extremist radio would tell the people who felt threatened to go to these sites. You'll be protected there. It's the norm. It's the acceptance. It's within humanitarian law. And so they went there and they filled these places chock-a-block. And in a place like this, there'd be double the amount of people, if not triple. And then when they were full, the extremists with their militias would come and throw a couple grenades in the roof and then open up the doors, and they would slaughter them, row after row after row. And so they still lie today. Row after row after row. Hours and hours. With machetes, they chop them up. And of course, an adult, you can't kill them really outright with one blow, so they'd injure them enough they couldn't move, and they'd let them rot there and die over a couple days. And they killed nuns and priests and brothers. Others they didn't kill. Others had opened the doors. Others had been complicit. Neighbor killed neighbor. Son killed mother because she was from the other ethnicity. There were over 90% of Judeo-Christians in Rwanda before the war started. Large percentage were Catholics. I had gone to church in Rwanda and see how practicing they were. We had nearly a century of our religion in that country. And in face of fear, it broke down so fast that we're still trying to imagine how they could kill 800,000 people and injure nearly 1 million in 100 days. How is it possible to be able to do that unless they were killing each other throughout the land, which ultimately is what happened? Brotherly love, the depth of our religion to stand up, was tested and found wanting. So was the Catholic Church and its structure in that country. Found wanting. The president was a very active Catholic. yet ran a dictatorship. There was a no questions shook us, as in the same time we saw others who gave their lives in defending them. But that was more the exception than the rule. And so, ladies and gentlemen, in Rwanda, over 300,000 children were killed, and a lot of them were killed by other children. So what of my sergeant in this village, in the chapel? Well, he immediately called the headquarters for transport to bring him to a safe place. This was an unusual circumstance. They obviously had just finished killing the population, hadn't gotten to the chapel yet. And so as the sergeant's on the radio and he's calling, from one edge of the village, there's about 30 boys, 9, 10, 12, 14, 15. And they got machine guns, light machine guns, many of them made available by the end of the Cold War and the peace dividend. We didn't need them anymore. So large quantities of that were sold off. And a large amount of it ended up in the hands of wackos and were distributed to these children to be used as child soldiers. So these young children who used them very effectively because they're so simple were shooting at the sergeant and his soldiers and at the people he was protecting. And as he's reeling from that on the other end of the village, there's about 20 girls, same ages, some of them pregnant, being used as shields. The girls are used as shields. Girls are used also as expendable material to walk through minefields, so they blow up on the mines so the boys can go through. And they're used as sex slaves and bushwives. Interesting, when we go into the countries like I was in Sierra Leone, in the bush, getting the kids out and demobilizing them. The average was about, for every 1,000 young boys we pulled out, we got about 15 girls. Not because the girls were less numerous, because the girls were more significant, more important. Because not only could they do and effectively fight and kill, but they also had all these other advantages of supporting the camp and sex slaves and the rest. And certainly the most difficult to repatriate were the girls into their communities, because the boys were going back to a male-dominated society that, well, he killed and slaughtered, but he was really a warrior, you know, and we can rehabilitate that fairly easily. But this girl who's been raped and has got a couple of children, oh, she's been soiled. We can't accept that. So these girls are trying to raise families living in internally displaced camps and refugee camps or between villages, and are being abused by every male who walks by. These child soldiers are out there and they're shooting at this sergeant and his soldiers and the people he's protecting, and they're dying and being injured around him. And the question is, what does the sergeant do? These children are killing. They're not volunteers. Most of them have been brought there, stolen from their homes and churches and communities, and some of them have been shot just to maintain discipline. What does the sergeant, what are the references we give that sergeant to take the right decision there? There's no military doctrine about shooting children. Our society certainly cannot comprehend shooting children, can't comprehend children killing. And so inside that sergeant and those who are with him commence traumas that put into question every fundamental reference they have. And they remain scarred by these references. There's a padre who's come back from one of these operations and has renounced the Catholic Church. He cannot imagine there's a God. Well, there's a corporal, amongst others, who live in this country and who fall into these bubbles. These are traumatic bubbles. They're the injury of our mind, physically, and also, of course, the resultant emotionally. And although with therapy they intrude, and these images come back in digital clarity and slow motion. It's no different in many cases from the soldiers of the Second World War. You know, you'll see an 18-year-old pimply journalist who's going to put a microphone in an octogenarian veteran who's going to say, how was it really on the beach on the 6th of June? And this gentleman will start saying, well, we were in the boat and this, and then all of a sudden, a minute and a half, maybe 2 minutes later, he's got a hard time speaking. And his eyes are glazed over. It's not because he's breaking down. It's because he's reliving those moments. Reliving them. He's back on the beach. His boots are wet. The brains of his buddy have just been blown on him. The bullets are flying. He's soiled his pants. He's back there living it. And so there are corporals in this country who hear the sergeant giving the order to fire. And they feel their finger pulling the trigger. And they feel the impact of the rifle in their shoulder, and they see the cartridge flying out. And they're looking through the sight, and they see the head of a child exploding. What references does he have? Does she have to meeting those challenges? What references did I have as their commander in scenarios of that nature? Was I allowed to negotiate with the extremists? To actually see the three leaders of the militia who in conversation with me said, okay, we'll stop massacring for 2 hours in this area. Saying it like this. And I'd say, how can you use those terms? I mean, how can you say stopping the massacre? How come you're massacring? And it would turn to me and say, how dare you ask me that question? And one of them said, don't you come and bring a moral reference to us. In the history of Africa, they didn't kill women and children. While my father and father-in-law and others who are here have family were fighting through Belgium, in Holland in the Second World War, the colonies were still functioning. And white soldiers were going into villages and wiping out villages to reestablish discipline and increase the productivity of the others. And the Germans were slaughtering the Jews. And we're going to tell them that they're barbarians. Well, in this absolutely ridiculous conversation, there was no sign of humanity. And that's why the book says shaking hands with the devil. Because fundamentally, when I looked at them in their eyes, they were no more human. These were not the eyes of human beings. This was the eyes of evil. And because of my religious background, Catholic, they were the devil. Literally. The devil had subsumed these humans This evil had gone through this nation, through this propaganda of its radio, where in a society like Rwanda, where the radio is sometimes, in some villages, nearly the voice of God, it influenced people to kill their own family members in all the hills and in all the churches. The devil was articulating the plan and implementing the plan in a country that was nearly paradise of Africa. And the leader of it, that I negotiated and discussed and argued with, was to me the most real personification of what Lucifer can be. In the most cold and calculating fashion, articulating the dimensions of our negotiations in regards to stopping the killing or reporting or lying about it and saying that it's not really them, it's somebody else, and he's got no control on it. Well, in negotiating with the devil to try to save some people, was I doing the right thing, or should I have taken my pistol out and shot them right between the eyes? That might have helped. It could have also brought their subordinates in and put the whole of my mission at risk and wipe out the whole of my mission. But what was the right answer there? Do I negotiate some lives to save some lives? Well, I know these people are slaughtering a whole bunch of others in the same place. I don't know if any of you have seen the movie Zulu, in which a small group of British soldiers were surrounded by the Zulus, by thousands and thousands of them, and they were being wiped out. And there's a night scene there about the commander looking at his command and expecting to be wiped out. And so on one evening, about the second week, nearly second week of the genocide, I'd been told by the international community, by New York, by the UN, by Kofi Annan, who was doing nothing more than expressing what the Security Council had told him, what the Americans had said on the first morning of the genocide. They said, we are not going into Rwanda, and we will support nobody who does. With over 40 million African Americans, not one of them raised a voice in objection. ABC, CBS, and NBC had more time for O.J. Simpson and Tanya Harding trying to kneecap her friend than he did for the genocide that was going on, and the information was being made available. It is a Judeo-Christian society. And they could see it. And they didn't want to join. And so I had been told that not only is there no cavalry coming over the hill, but they wanted the whole lot of us out. And I had taken the decision that I was not leaving. I had over 20,000 Rwandans under my protection from both sides, on both sides of the fighting lines. And there was an absolute guarantee that I lifted my protection, they'd all be slaughtered within hours. And I said there was no way we were leaving. And the soldiers who were with me were African, Ghanaian, and Tunisian. And so they stayed. But their capabilities were very limited. And so I was standing in my office by the window, and my lights were off because you don't want to silhouette yourself to be shot. And I had a very feeble wire around my headquarters, and I had about 30 troops. And we were protecting in my headquarters a couple of the moderate leaders. And we knew the extremist unit, elite unit of commandos were making their way towards us, and the militias were gathering. And it was dark. Africa is dark at night. There's no ambient light. In fact, there was no light left, no electricity, except our small generator. And all of a sudden, through the screen of the window, I heard what seemed to be either just a little breeze, or maybe the voices of people who were being slaughtered at a distance, the screaming, the crying. That night, I was facing the decision of either to pull out and save all my soldiers, and all those Rwandans we killed, or to stay, put my soldiers at risk in a situation that nobody wanted us to do. They wanted us all out. And as the visions of Khartoum or Zulu and these desperate commands get wiped out in the end, I expected that in fact that's what was going to happen, and that's what the Belgians had predicted. We'd all be slaughtered. That's why they wanted us out. As I'm going down this hill, all of a sudden, I sensed that I wasn't alone. I wasn't alone. Something had entered the room. Something had vibrated or had touched or had influenced or entered or something. But in a nanosecond, after that sound, I was strengthened to the extent that I was able to continue my command for months afterwards and sustain the casualties and continue to see the atrocities and the traumas and the dilemmas and continue to attempt in saving Rwandans. There is a God because there is a devil, and they exist. They exist not like that. They exist. It's there. And so, a few years ago, I had to take a decision on whether or not I wanted to continue to live or to join all those spirits that continued to invade me, and those hundreds of pairs of eyes that kept invading. You ever see 50,000 people walking on a road with barely what they can carry? With the elders dying in the mud and the rain, or a woman giving birth to a child and trying to get up and falling down dead, with the child still connected to her, alive. You ever see a person laying there looking at you with bewildered eyes as they're dying, saying, "What happened? I thought you Blue Berets were supposed to help us. And here I am in the middle of nowhere. In the middle of nowhere, dying." And all these bewildered eyes beckoning and saying, "Who gave you the right to live? Who gave you the right to laugh, to love?" In the First World War, a number of soldiers would not be able to go over the top. Or if they went over, they became berserk of the trauma of facing near a certain death. There is nearly no report of a young officer or junior officers in the platoons and companies, the lower front line, of ever turning their back to those missions. However, there are incredible statistics that after all these battles, where these young officers had 30 or 100 soldiers on them, and they'd come back and he wouldn't be scarred, but he had lost 70 of them. That they would go behind the trenches and they'd blow their brains out. Because of the guilt. The guilt of being alive, of having survived it. And so as I was wrestling with this, I came upon the solution that in fact there can be an optimism to this. That is to say that I can believe in that maybe in 2 or 3 centuries from now, we will no more have conflict because of our differences. We would have solved this fact. We would have given the answer that no, all humans are human. However, to get to that, it would need work every day in advancing human rights, in advancing the rights of the individual, in advancing the brotherly love, in advancing our belief that there is in humanity soul and reason. And although there will be millions who will be slaughtered between now and then, one day this is going to stop. And so committing myself to, in fact, that advancement of human rights, the rights of the individual, and looking at this nation that has an incredible work ethic. It masters technology. It has no imperial ambitions to subjugate others. It's never had it. We have been failing more often than not with our First Nations. We haven't solved that. Really come to grips with it. But we have not searched out strategically to put others under our palm. And we believe, as our charter has articulated, in human rights and the rights of the individual. We have that in us. The soldiers and the diplomats and the humanitarians leave these shores with that. It comes from our society and it comes from our beliefs. It comes from being Catholic, or Protestant, or Jewish. It comes from a fundamental belief in a much higher plane to life. It comes from the belief that humanity is an ensemble. It's an ensemble, it's not portions thereof. A young platoon commander ended up, we did that a lot, I'm afraid, entering villages after massacres. Very quiet, a village that's been massacred. You might hear a rooster or a bird. Very eerie. At the end of the village, there were a couple, well, more than a couple, young girls, young women who had been raped and chopped, and there were some young children. They weren't dead, but they certainly didn't have much chance to live.
but they were still alive, and a couple were conscious. Now, there was over 30% of HIV/AIDS in that country before the war started, before the bloodletting. And soldiers don't walk around with rubber gloves and all kinds of protection. They tend to scratch themselves on all kinds of things. And so this platoon commander had a decision to take. His 30 soldiers behind him, what should they do in this circumstance? Does the platoon commander order his troops into the trench to try to provide solace, maybe save one, and risk contracting HIV/AIDS, which at those levels is a near guarantee? Or does he order his troops not to go into the trench, to walk by, let them die? They're about to die anyways. Well, I had 26 nations under my command, and I went to every contingent commander. I said, what would your platoon commander do? 23 of the 26 nations said that their platoon commander would order the troops to walk by. 3 nations said they'd go in. The Dutch, the Ghanaians. In 1962, when Ghana got its independence from the British, it turned to Canada to help it build its institutions, including its military, and we still do. The Ghanaians said they'd go in. Well, by the time this platoon commander turned around, he couldn't give an order because his troops were already in the trench helping, and they were Canadian. What makes us do that? What makes us do it? Good training? Our society, our institutions, our churches? We are different. We have so much in skills and capabilities and beliefs and strong work ethic. We don't walk by people who suffer. And that's why the diplomats and the humanitarians and the soldiers, when they have a few minutes, are building schools and helping and doing things. What makes us do that? What gives us that inner strength to go instinctively beyond your self-protection to help other human beings? Well, ladies and gentlemen, you and those who preceded you are the ones who have made us what we are, and in fact, we're shaping the next generations to be what we are and hopefully better. This nation has created standards of ethics and moral reference that no other nation, although some may articulate, have applied. Our military is being held to standards that nobody else has. And although in the early 90s, as we saw our way through the Somalia catastrophe and conducted so many of the reforms, many nations looked at us as wimps, as, this is not serious soldiering. Only to find out today that they're paying the price for not maybe following a lead of a nation. And we're certainly seeing it in Iraq, and there are all kinds of examples throughout many of the missions of other nations' abuses. This nation has standards that have been established on some very solid grounds. And our church has been participatory actively in establishing those grounds and continues to be so. And although our institutions have been found on occasion wanting, the essence of what they are is still there. The Army was wanting in the early 90s and has reformed and is no more conservative bastion outside society. It's now a value-added instrument of advancing our society, our beliefs. It's out there advancing human rights, the rights of individuals, what we believe in. It's not fighting the wars, it's in wars. Assisting those who hopefully will bring human rights and democracy to their nations. And those young men and women are coming right out of the schools, right out of the institutions that we've created in this country and support and continue to do so. And so, ladies and gentlemen, we are being tested out there like we've never been tested before. And on occasion, we find ourselves wanting. On occasion, we're injured so bad that we can't see what reality is anymore. What is real and not real? Is the genocide in Rwanda real? Is life here unreal, artificial? But I cherish those days when I was particularly suffering from my injury, that I would go to Montreal where I was getting some therapy, and I'd take a break from it and I'd go to the cathedral on Dorchester Street and sit there. And I'd sit there not because of the music or even because there was Mass on occasion. I sat there because I found serenity, solace. I could think. I felt protected. And in all the places, including my own home, where our families are having problems living with these experiences, my mother-in-law, when I came back from Africa, said she would have never survived the Second World War if she had gone through what my family had gone through. In the Second World War, there was no information. Today, the families are there waiting for the next program to say we're shot or injured or captured. And so they live the missions with us. Maybe not all the depravities, but they live the stress and the strains with us. And so we come back injured to find our families often injured. Sometimes the last people you can talk to are families because they're just too close, too intimate. The only place that I found security, serenity, that I could meditate, that I could find it was worth existing and maybe raising myself to the level of living, was in those moments in that cathedral. And so on occasion I do go back and sit there and find that strength. And hopefully I'll sense again that breeze or that thing that came so real to me that night when I decided that we were going to stick it out and we were going to save as many as we could, no matter what the cost would be. And ladies and gentlemen, our church gives us that. And thankfully, many of us don't have to be tested to that degree, but tested every day we are, ethically and morally. And references of your church are crucial. And I only thank the fact that I do have a religious reference, that although not the most practicing, at least I can turn somewhere to find the real and ultimate serenity of my mind and my soul and my heart. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Romeo Dallaire has graciously accepted the invitation to respond to a few questions. Now, Ivan has got a mic at the back here, Ivan person. He would really, if there's a large crowd, but so that we can all hear the questions and so we can get a record of the answers as well as the questions, we would ask you to raise your hand. General Dallaire will acknowledge the person who asked the question. Please wait until Ivan has a chance to get the mic to you. And please keep the mic close to your mouth so that it picks up the question.
And it could be of any nature and as candid as you want to be. Yes, sir. The mic is mobile.
I've been working with refugees in 1985 for over 28 countries, and since 1992, some of them have been from Rwanda. Many of them, in fact all of them, have been in Zambia. I have at my home the 10 Commandments, which I'm sure you're familiar with, that were issued by the Hutus against the Tutsis, long before the genocide ever started. Now, in Zambia, starting about a year and a half ago, until about 6 months ago, I was notified by some people, Rwandans, that they were being hunted down, being persecuted and threatened with death and other acts of violence. Is that continuing? Why was it being done?
Well, it's not just there are other places. The extremists were not totally defeated on the battlefield, nor were their political leaders brought to justice. On the third night of the genocide, I got 45 minutes warning that the French were landing. And they were followed by the Belgians and a little later on by the Italians. And the Americans had landed in Bujumbura, which is the capital of Burundi. So there were about 2,500 superbly trained troops that within a couple days of that were on the ground moving the expatriates. And the troops made it quite clear that they were not going to work for me to try to stop the genocide. They were there under orders to essentially get the white people out, was the expression they used, to get the expatriates out. However, in a couple of the first planes that the French flew out with, my observers noticed that a number of Rwandans, well-dressed and of significant importance, were evacuated. And so today you still have the leadership of the extremist Hutu movement living in Europe, and you still have the remnants of their army that withdrew under the protection of the French to the Congo and is still functioning. And so what you're seeing is, on one side, the extremists biding their time and doing some raids into Rwanda to restart the exercise, but in reverse. But you're also seeing a reaction from those who won the war, the Tutsi-dominated Rwandan Patriotic Front, who are taking proactive actions to eliminate what they were calling the threat. And so you're seeing both sides functioning in other countries still. And that's nothing more than crass use of force, abuse of rules for ulterior motives that both of them will say is for the betterment of their ethnicity and their society. And that's pretty well as close as I can get to it. Yes, ma'am.
Sir, I suspect many people were following your testimony at the ICTR in January. I'm wondering how and if it's possible to participate in something like that without it seeming ridiculously insufficient under the circumstances.
Oh, wow. Yes, I realized that not many authors actually find their book being analyzed in an international criminal court. And the author sitting on the stand being questioned into the veracity of all this information. I think my experience there is excellent. When I left Rwanda, two things stayed with me. One was that I would never let the Rwandan genocide die. They don't have the power or the money or the influence as, let's say, the Jewish community. And they don't even have the strength of the Armenian community. And so we've seen already, 10 years later, some people, revisionists, talking about double genocides and it really didn't happen that way and so on. And so it's absolutely crucial that, as on one side we're using never again, that it also be applied to the Rwandans in hoping to avoid genocides into the future. The other mission I gave myself was the fact that I considered that my command would end not when I finished my secondment contract with the UN, which was in August of '94, and also it did not end when I was medically released from the forces in 2000. It would end when the International Criminal Court did not need me anymore. In both sides. One as a witness for the prosecution or possibly for the defense, but also if I have nothing to answer for in accountability towards it, because you just can't go in because you're from the developed world into these countries, test out your skills and try to find solutions and then walk out and say, well, I did the best I can. We do move there because they're human beings who need support and assistance, and we are to be held accountable for that. And so to me, the International Tribunal is as inefficient as it is the embryo of justice, which is an absolute. And as such, I have to respond, and I've been twice, and I'll go a third time, probably next winter. And when that court takes its decision, then I will rest with that decision. My mission will be then over of commander of the UN force. It's interesting that the United States has refused to sign into the International Criminal Court. We've led the charge, which is one of the great things of this nation. We're leading to not often enough. So that court has done a lot of on-job training, but it is, I think, still very important. And some will say, oh yeah, well, the Tutsis did some massacring too, and they should be held accountable. Listen, the court is to function, and its aim is justice, and you can be pragmatic and say, well, it's the winner's justice and so on. Well, ultimately, we don't want that. Ultimately, we want to have excellent lawyers defending those people so that they do get justice. It's not a kangaroo court. And I've participated in the International Tribunal for one reason, overriding it all, is the fact that it doesn't have capital punishment. And even with all the killing and the slaughtering, and as a soldier and the use of weapons, I would never, ever, ever have participated in that International Tribunal if it had the ability for capital punishment. But let me just end this short answer. In Den Haag, they've got the court for Yugoslavia. I've been there. Very impressive buildings, infrastructure, technology. It's an extraordinary establishment that you would expect to see for an international criminal court, which is the international community's expression of trying to eliminate, eradicate impunity and so on, and bring people to justice internationally. But in Arusha, it's a dump. In Arusha, if you want a pencil, you got to really search it out. In Den Haag, there are pencils coming out of the walls. In Arusha, witnesses were being killed on the outside of town. There was no witness protection. How many witnesses would have had to be killed in Den Haag before they establish protection? Why is it in Arusha the toilets can be non-flushing and functional and there's no money, but in Den Haag it is top of the line? If you're going to set up an international tribunal, the expression of the international community in a town that is really a hick town, it's on the edge of the Serengeti. It's people just go through there to go on safaris. It's a nothing town. And you want to create such an international capability in order to provide the expression of justice to the Rwandans. Then why do you do it there? And then why do you complain it costs so much? And then why do you complain that maybe not the best of lawyers or judges are there? Remember residual? It wouldn't be accepted in Den Haag. How come the Rwandans and the Africans got to accept it in Arusha? And so our expressions are very very in evidence that maybe we're not as transparent and committed as we should be. Also, the International Tribunal could have gotten an incredible boost, and I think the whole international community is after 9/11. Okay, 2,800 people died. I could hear them because I'd hear the sounds of them dying when the floors were coming down and the screams. It's interesting how the world was mobilized because of that, yet a few years earlier, 800,000 died and nobody came. In fact, everybody left. But passing beyond that, it would have been really interesting if the world leading power, Christian power, although it tries to camouflage it, if it had said, instead of going to find all these Al-Qaeda and blow them away, or we'll put them in jail and we'll throw away the Geneva Convention, they said, we're going in there, we're going to find them, and we're going to bring them to the International Criminal Court. And we're going to take 23 years, if necessary, to try them. And at the end of that, they'll get whatever sentence comes out of it. And if it's life, well, they go into a prison and they're buried in the prison yard. And if something else, it's something else. But we would gain for 23 years the jurisprudence, the knowledge of how to operate. We would also send a signal to every other wacko to say, hey, impunity doesn't work anymore. Sooner or later, we're going to get you. We lost that magnificent opportunity. And now we're ending up with bullies. And who's going to outdo the other? And we end up, ladies and gentlemen, with insecurity now that resembles, and some people think is worse than the insecurity we had in the 50s at the height of the Cold War with the nuclear threat. At least with the nuclear threat, you knew who was pressing the button. You knew what rules they were operating from. You had a chance to stop it, and you worked tirelessly to do that. We have no clue what's going on right now to that extent. We cannot control it to that extent. And that's the status in which we find ourselves because a lack of statesmanship, a lack of will, with all that intellectual power, and I think simply a lack of realization of what is humanity. But we find ourselves in this insecurity, and one of the worst results of it is watch out for our civil liberties. How far will they go to protect us against this threat that we cannot often even qualify? It makes us all ultimately vulnerable. And how come we let all these Americans dictate this to us? This is unacceptable. We're an independent state. We're no more the kid on the block. The old fogies of Europe have now got to realize, and the Americans, that we're adult. This country is an adult country. It's no more a young kid country. Can't pat us on the head and say, follow us. So what are these Americans imposing so much on us? And if you remember, we reacted to that after 9/11. However, we got a problem with our own history. Up until the White Paper in 1964, we had a military force of significance based on the defense of this nation. And then in 1964, our politicians took a look at this and said, this is expensive. And yes, we were introducing a lot of social programs. And they said, we're going to accept the risk. And the risk is going to be balanced out by the fact that we got these great friends south of the border who are going to take care of us. And so for 40 years, we've been hacking and slashing the defense budget, increasing the level of risk, but also, if not subliminally, well, at least, in essence, possibly, we've been giving more and more responsibility to the Americans. And then all of a sudden they decide to use it, and we get all pissed off.